all from me. So I'll hand over to Sarah. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jen. Afternoon, everyone. So if we can just move on to the next slide, which should hopefully be what we're going to look at today. Yep, so we're looking at how you claim costs under NEC. And so that's predominantly the SCC, the Schedule of Cost Components, and then the shorter Schedule of Cost Components, SSCC. I'm going to talk about them as the schedule and the shorter schedule. And of course, in terms of talking about claiming costs, it wouldn't be complete if we didn't also talk about the fee percentage and how that fits in as with the schedule and the shorter schedule. So if we can have the next slide, please. Okay, so as we often do with these webinars, we're kind of looking high level and we're going to sort of gradually get into the details. So we're going to look at when and how you use these schedules in the context of the work that you're going to do under NEC. And then as we move through, we're actually then towards the end going to look at the detail of the schedules themselves. So they're usually found right at the back, I think, of the NEC form of contract. I often struggle to find them. And they're about kind of 4 to 6 pages long. So when do you use the schedule of cost components? So first bullet point, it is used for option C, D and E of the NEC form of contracts. So they are your pain gain sharing contracts, that's C and D, and then E is the reimbursable contract. And it's basically used to calculate the monthly interim payment applications that you make in regard to each of those contracts. So it is quite important. So the schedule of cost components is referred to in the defined cost. So in the interim payment applications, contractor can claim, and subcontractors in a subcontract claims the defined cost, which is roughly in NEC3 split into two. The first bit is the elements in the schedule of cost components. And the second part is subcontractor costs, which is dealt with separately in NEC3. What we see in NEC4 is a change. So the defined cost is simply referred to as the elements in the schedule of cost components, and the subcontractor costs have been inserted into it. So it's not a huge change. It's more, where is the information? Where will you find it? Personally, I think it's a good amendment to have made because I like efficiency. So, you know, all you need to do now is focus on the schedule rather than having to look at the defined cost and the schedule in conjunction with each other. Bear in mind that you have the defined cost, but the paying party can deduct what's called disallowed cost. So the disallowed cost is defined in the core clauses at 11.225. Now, essentially, there are lots of items of disallowed cost, but they're basically items to allow the paying party to exclude monies where the contractor hasn't worked efficiently. And this is one of a number of what I would call checks and balances. Contractor, subcontractor can claim X, but the checks and balances are, you know, they've got to work efficiently. The paying party isn't required to pay for inefficient working. So we have the defined cost, and we'll see how that is made up. But in addition, the paying party will also pay the contractor's fee percentage and the subcontractor's fee percentage. And we'll have a look what that covers. But very fundamentally, it's overhead and profit. A few more extra things, but we'll come to that in a minute. So if we can move on to the next slide, please, Jen. Thanks. So when do you use the shorter schedule of cost components as opposed to the schedule? So it is what it says, it's shorter than the schedule of cost components. So it's logical to use it in cost price options A and B of NEC, because options A and B are fixed price contracts. So you might think, well, why do we need any kind of schedule, shorter or otherwise, when we've got a fixed price contract? Good question. The shorter schedule is used for these contracts A and B to calculate the value of compensation events. So it has a much more limited use than the schedule of cost components within options C to E. So that's worth bearing in mind, but still really important, because of course, you know, where there are a lot of CEs on a project, and you never know, I suspect when you enter into a contract how many CEs there are going to be. Where there are a lot, you know, I suspect this can be make or break in terms of whether a project is profitable or not. So that's predominantly when you would use the shorter schedule. There are two other situations where you could use the shorter schedule. So the second bullet point applies the shorter schedule if the project manager and contractor agree to use the shorter schedule to calculate the monthly interim payment application costs for contract C to E. Personally, I've never seen that happen. And for the purposes of NEC 4, this provision's been removed, which probably reflects the fact that it's not well used. The final scenario is where the project manager is making an assessment. Now, again, I've never seen this used. It's been removed for NEC 4 and it applies for options A to E. So if we can have the next slide, please. Okay, so we've sort of looked at the shorter schedule and the schedules, high level in terms of how they're used for each contract, depending on the pricing mechanism. So we also need to look at the contract data. So in NEC, we have contract data part 1, which is the part that is filled in by the paying party, so the employer, or in a subcontract, the subcontractor. And we have contract data part 2, which is completed by the contractor in a contract, or a subcontractor in a subcontract. So if you're a contractor or a subcontractor, you know, if you're not familiar with NEC, I suspect you'll immediately be kind of thinking that you understand what things you'll be required to fill in for contract data part 2, and obviously business name, price, but also, you know, lots of items for the purpose of pricing either the works or compensation events, depending on which contract you're working under. So there are 4 elements in the contract data part 2 that need to be completed depending on which form of contract is being used. Now, I could probably say this every seminar, but a long time ago when we weren't hugely familiar with NEC, I had a dispute where my client was the subcontractor in a subcontract, and they'd filled in their business name and address in the contract data part 2 and nothing else. The rest was blank. And that caused, there was then a dispute about compensation events and how to value them. And it caused huge problems, as you would imagine, in not having any pricing figures in the contract data part 2. So the 4 sections of, and these are the 4 sub-bullet points in this slide. So the data, so basically the information to be inserted by the contractor or subcontractor as appropriate, but the shorter schedule with regards to options A and B. So basically for pricing compensation events when you're on those forms of contract. The next part section is for the schedule of cost components for those interim payment applications when you're working on options C to E. Next section is the design data for both the schedule and the shorter schedules. So that's basically for off-site design. So I would imagine for most contractors and subcontractors, that's to cover the consultant's design fees, or it may be that you have internal consultants. And then finally, we have data to use in conjunction with the shorter schedule in circumstances where options C, D and E are being used. So that's that situation that we've just looked at, for example, where the PM decides to assess using the shorter schedule where it's options C, D and E, or where both parties agree. So that's the information that needs completing. So you can see that, for example, the shorter schedule elements need completing if you're on options A and B for those sub-bullet points, number 1, not 2, but 3, 3 and then not 4. Conversely, you need to fill in sub-bullets 2, 3 and 4 if you're on options C to E. So just be careful and make sure you fill in the right ones. A lot of this information that's been inserted is either for rates, so typically hourly rates for specific disciplines of people, so labourer, an hourly rate or a daily rate, for example, or percentages to be applied. So percentages in my view, are always good because it suggests a sort of easy, albeit rough and ready, way of calculating things. But if you do a lot of claims for contractors and subcontractors, you'll realise that percentages are often a nice, easy way of doing it. So a good in my book. And that's why it's important to complete it properly. If a rate's required, insert it. If a percentage is required, insert it. And obviously you need to think about, what the rate should be and what the percentage should be. Be careful so that to ensure that you don't miss any rates and percentages, or you end up struggling in the scenario that I described, where how do we calculate something if there's a blank? So, if the hourly rate is blank pounds per hour, that's going to be £0 per hour. If the percentage is blank, not filled in percentage, it's got to be 0, hasn't it? So just be really careful with that. Next slide, please. Okay, so moving kind of closer to the detail of the schedule and the shorter schedule. It's got 7 sections that are set out in the slide here. This is for NEC 3. Of course, I've already mentioned that for NEC 4, the subcontractor claim is included. So I think that's included as a new 4, which means from charges, which is the current 4 on NEC 3 downwards, the numbers all shunt down 1. And it's all fairly common sense, high level. So people, that's basically people, human beings. The key thing here is what and when you can claim for those people, and it's to do with the definition of working areas. So the working areas is defined in the contract data, part 2. So again, it's something for contractor and subcontractor and a subcontract to have a think about, and we'll look at that in a bit more detail. Number 2 is equipment. So that's the cranes, the equipment that is used to assist in carrying out the construction work. Number 3, plant and materials. So that's the sort of bricks and mortar, what is going to form the whatever is being constructed. The 4th one, so remember 4 in NEC 4 is subcontractors, which is pretty self-explanatory. But the 4th one here in NEC 3 is charges. So it's sort of it's sort of a miscellaneous sector, but it includes consumables. So things like statutory authority fees. It includes some costs of testing. So to my mind, they're not going to be huge amounts of money. Also includes some kind of site equipment. So not your site cabins, but all the kit that goes in the site cabins, and also some small tools. So again, we'll have a look at that in more detail, but it's sort of a sort of miscellaneous bunch of costs. Next one is manufacture and fabrication. Now, the key to this is that it's off-site manufacture and fabrication. So I suspect for most CECA members, that means a third party carrying that out. And the penultimate one is design. Again, that's off-site design, and I've already said, suspect that would probably be designed by a consultancy firm or possibly your own internal designers. The final one's insurance. I'd sort of wipe that from your memory, really, because it is not talking about insurance premiums. It's talking about what happens if there is an insurance claim. The insurers make a payment. How is that money dealt with? So I suspect that is something that would be dealt with by someone else within your organisations. So sort of, wipe that from my mind, because I think it's quite dangerous, because personally I would just assume that it was relating to insurance premiums, and it's not. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're still high level here, so I want to look at the fee percentage. So the fee percentage, and this is clause 52.1, so one of the core clauses across all of the options A to E priced contracts. So the clause at 52.1 states that the fee percentage covers everything that isn't included in the schedule or the shorter schedule. So this is where the problem arises, where you don't fill in the contract data properly, and you remember it's not filled in. So we have, the percentage for something is blank percent. So it's 0%. You can't then say, oh, well, it's obvious that we've missed that, because of this clause that says if it's not covered through the schedule and the shorter schedule, then it's deemed to be included within the fee percentage. So that's the contractor and the subcontractor in a subcontractor. That's their sort of representation, that's their position. So you cannot then go behind that and say, yeah, but even if, for example, the fee percentage was 2%, so you could say, well, it's clear that we haven't included anything for design overheads because the percentage for it is hasn't been filled in. So and it's clear it's not in the fee percentage because our fee percentage is super low at 1% or 2%. The clause, the key thing is that clause 52.1 says that everything is included in that fee percentage if it's not covered in the schedule or shorter schedule. So the idea is, and this is the second bullet point, that very roughly the fee percentage covers overhead and profit. It also includes other things, and these are set out in the NEC guidance notes. So it covers insurance premiums, recruitment costs, finance charges, guarantees. So there are other things that it does include as well. So just be aware of that. And then finally, clause 52.1 states that contractors and subcontractors must pass back to the employer the benefit of any discounts it gets. So where I've seen this is in terms of sort of discounts for purchasing materials. Where a particular contractor might get a 15% 10-15% discount with a particular supplier. So any discount that is given, the contractor's got to pass that back to the employer. The reason for this, and what we'll be seeing, is a number of sort of checks and balances throughout. So the idea, very roughly, is that what the contractor is entitled to be paid and the subcontractor through the schedule, on the shorter schedule, is its actual cost of the items that are being used. So the actual cost of the people, the actual cost of the equipment being used, the actual cost of the materials. So you get that base cost so that the contractor isn't out of pocket, but equally hasn't made any money. And then the fee percentage is what covers that overhead and profit, and those are the miscellaneous amounts. So that's sort of quite on a fairly rough and ready basis, how it's all supposed to work, and therefore there are lots of checks and balances, some in the contract as we see here, but also some in the schedule and the shorter schedule to make sure that it works like that. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. Okay, yeah, so very, very quickly, and we covered this last month. So what is a compensation event? Now, bear in mind, of course, that we're talking about the schedule and the shorter schedule. So we're not just talking about compensation events here. That's correct. We are just talking about compensation events if we're talking about options A and B. But if we're talking about options C to E, no, we're not just talking about compensation events. So a compensation event is an increase to the prices. It's also your extension of time, whether that's to the completion date or a section date, and it's an extension of time to your key dates, and it's also your sort of loss and expense, so your costs relating to the delay. And finally, and this is standard across construction contracts, it can't be something that arises from the contractor's fault or error, ditto subcontractor. So we have this quote. So the second bullet point is a quote from the guidance notes for NEC3, and it says the engineering and construction contract is designed to ensure that the contractor will be unaffected financially. So it's a funny quote, but it's basically meaning that the contractor should be able to recover its costs regarding compensation events. And this is why we're looking at that base cost rather than, so if you're familiar with JCT, the way to quantify elements, so variations, loss and expense under JCT, first port of call is to look at the contract rates, and if there's an appropriate contract rate, that's what we use. We don't have that here for compensation events. It's not a case of looking at our option A or B fixed price and looking at the rates there, because of course rates, those rates might have been priced, keenly by the contractor. As we're seeing now, the compensation event could occur months, if not years into the contract, and prices might have gone up. So the compensation event, if it looks at, old prices in the fixed price, it's not then ensuring the contract is unaffected financially by the compensation event. In that situation, the contractor would be affected detrimentally. So this is where this comes from. But the idea also is that the paying party can't say, oh, well, you've priced this in your fixed price for X, and therefore, the compensation event work will be priced on that basis. That's not how it works. So if we can move on to the next slide, please, Jen. So this just repeats what we've looked at before, and it's the index of items in the schedule and the shorter schedule. So we're going to go through each one in a little bit more detail. So if we can have the next slide, please. Okay, So we're going to compare each of those 7 headings between the schedule and the shorter schedule. Final bullet point there talks about the ECC, the engineering and construction contract, which is the NEC, the contract that we're focusing on. It's comparing the contract and the subcontract. Both have the schedule and the shorter schedule. If you work predominantly on the subcontract, what you will find is the schedule and the shorter schedule that we're talking about here, which is the main belongs to the main contract, is pretty, I would say probably 99% the same for the subcontract as it is for the main contract. And the middle bullet point, it's one of these checks and balances. So what both the schedule and the shorter schedule say is that you can only include an amount once when you're claiming. So the example that I like to use here is that, you know, you might be claiming for a crane. If that includes the crane operator, then you claim it under equipment for a crane, including the operator. You cannot, in addition, claim for the operator under the people section in that first heading. So it's to avoid double counting, which probably makes sense, but it's expressly included in both the shorter schedule and the schedule. So if we can move on to the next slide, please, Jan. Thanks. So the first item we had were people. The most important part of construction, can't do anything without the people. So the shorter schedule of cost components allows contractors and subcontractors in a subcontract to recover the cost of people paid for by the contractor, but it includes the subcontractors. It's all around the working areas, as we've already noted. It's a bit more vague. So the shorter schedule is obviously shorter than the schedule. So it's not a bit more vague. It's more condensed than the schedule. So it states that the payments that you can recover include those made under the law and also pension payments. Similar provisions, this is the next bullet point, in the schedule of cost components, but with more detail. So you can recover the cost of employees paid for by the contractor in the working areas, but as I say, with greater detail as to what's included. And we'll see a little bit of that detail later on. So for example, it talks about the sort of perks. So it would include company cars, what do you call it, kind of food, sustenance, whilst working, accommodation, if it includes overnight stays, redundancy cover, training. So it's all those kind of costs. It's pretty, you'll kind of hopefully immediately be getting a feel for the sort of kind of detail that's included. So the next bullet point down covers both the shorter schedule and the schedule, and it allows contractors and subcontractors to include employees whose normal place of work is within the working areas, albeit that the work they're doing that's being claimed might not be being done in the working areas. So hopefully you're seeing here that the working areas is quite an important definition. It's defined within the contract data part 2, so the contractor or the subcontractor defines it. Typically, it would certainly include the site, because clearly you would want to include for the cost of the people working within the site. It might include a sort of extra piece of land adjacent to the site or near to it, which might be used for site setup, for example. Also, for reasons that we're seeing, you might sometimes contractors and subcontractors also include their head office or other offices to widen the net. And what I'm saying more recently is a reference to people working from home. Now, This is to basically cover a potential anomaly for that third bullet point. So you could have somebody working from home, you know, what 55% of the time is spent on site, but for one particular day, they're working at home for whatever reason. Can you, but they're working on this particular project, can you claim for them if it's a compensation event, or if you're applying for payment on options C to E? Well, you can include employees, this is the third bullet point, whose normal place of work is within the working areas, but they're working somewhere else today. So we comply with that, providing that their percentage, so I think we said 55% working on this project, does that make that project their normal place of work? I don't know. There's no case law on it. You know, I think if it was 80% of the time usually working there, you're clear. 50% probably not, because how can it be normal? You know, if you're only working there half time. So that's the scenario it's designed to cover, people working in your head office or one of your other offices, or working from home or somewhere else, but they're being shared between several sites. And then the final bullet point for both the schedule and the shorter schedule, you can include in your claims employees. Oh, sorry, we've covered that. All right, I think it's yeah, this maybe the next slide actually, that covers agency workers. So if we can, yeah, so yeah, so we've sort of talked about the working area. So remember to think about what you want that working area to cover. Is it just the site? Is it slightly wider than that? Because if people are working in an adjacent area, you know, that will need to be covered, or possibly wider. And obviously, you know, I go back to the fee percentage point that we've already seen. You know, if, for example, the working area is just defined as the site, and I don't know, farmer's field adjacent to the site is hired, anybody working in that area, potentially you can't claim their cost because it's not within the working area. And if they're working there 80% of the time, their normal place of work isn't within the working area either. So you're going to really struggle to claim any of their costs. So I said, the second bullet point, I said the schedule contained more detail as to what kind of costs you can claim for people. And 12C, so this is in the schedule, it's all numbered, so this is the numbering. It allows a claim for working in special circumstances. The guidance notes say that that could be something like working at height, shift allowances, food allowances, etc. So that kind of shows how detailed it is. And what you're actually looking at, so for a compensation event, you're looking to forecast how long the work will take to do, and who and what will be required to do the work. So for example, if you think the work might take 2 days and it'll take, you know, I don't know, 4 members of the team, I'm not going to look at specific disciplines, you would be looking at pricing those 4 people. What do they cost the business? And of course, they may all be the same discipline, but they may all cost the business a different amount. They may be paid different rate, a different salary or different rates. They may have a different package. One might have health insurance, one might not. So all these things need to be priced on an individual basis. We're not talking about you know, what's the rate for a quantity surveyor? We're talking about what does this particular quantity surveyor cost the business? And, you know, if you've got 2 quantity surveyors, you'll be looking at the cost of the other one to the business as well. So hopefully you're getting the feeling, and the view that this could be quite onerous and could be quite difficult to agree with the project manager. So the third bullet point, both the schedule and shorter schedule allow the contractor or subcontractor to include overtime costs, but it's subject to these checks and balances that I've mentioned. So you can only claim the overtime providing the work couldn't have been completed by other employees on ordinary rates. So you're looking at, were there employees, of the correct discipline so people who could have done the job, with nothing to do, on a particular day, but overtime was paid to other people to do the work. If that was the case, then that will be disallowed. You won't be able to claim it. And again, this is aimed at promoting efficiency from the contractor and subcontractor on the basis that the paying party, the employer, shouldn't have to pay for contractor or subcontractors' inefficient working. Yeah, and this is the bullet point that I was talking about before. Both the schedule and the shorter schedule allow third-party labour to be claimed, not on an individual basis, but it's on an open market or competitively tendered rate. So the next slide, please. Okay, so we've done number one, so that's the people. The next one is the equipment. So it's a defined term under NEC. So this is clause 11.27 of the core clauses, and it's defined as equipment is what's used to provide the works. So, I've used the example of the crane previously. It also includes the cost of the site accommodation, but, and this is the third bullet point, some of what you might ordinarily think is equipment is included in that miscellaneous section for charges. So small tools, basically all the stuff that goes in the site cabin, they're all included under charges. Now, I think the reason for that might seem a bit cumbersome, but the reason for that under NEC 3 is that they're all calculated. So, if you've got to calculate, the cost of a computer for a compensation event or, hand tools, it's going to be pretty onerous. The charges, some of them, including these small items of equipment, are included as a percentage via the contract data part 2. So it just makes it easier to calculate. Note, however, that percentage has been removed from NEC 4. So I'm a bit frustrated about that because, as I said earlier, I do like percentages. And I think, it will be a little bit frustrating having to quantify, 2 hours of, I don't know, using a computer. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. So the shorter schedule for equipment has two options. The first one is your equipment is priced on any rates that are listed in the contract data. So we've got two, and again, within that, we've got two options. So the first is that the contract data might refer to a published list. So for example, CECA has a list of equipment prices. So if the contract data where it says, equipment is priced on published list dash, if it says CECA rates, or sometimes it might say CECA minus 5% or whatever, then all of the rates in the CECA list apply, plus or minus whatever has been put in. There's also an option to add others. So it says something like, if not in a published list, other equipment is. So if you have particular equipment that you know that you're going to use, particular if you're on option C to E, put that in and put the rates in. And then the second option, which is the sort of fallback, the sort of coverall, is that anything else, anything that's not in the published list that's mentioned in the contract data and not in the specific equipment mentioned in the contract data, so anything else is priced at competitively tendered or open market rates. So if there's nothing there in your contract data, you're probably okay, because it's just priced at competitively tender or open market rates. Obviously, there are commercial advantages and disadvantages to each of those options, which I'm not going to go into. But, you know, hopefully you're not going to end up in a situation where, you know, you're using a crane and you're not entitled to charge for it. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. So this is the schedule of cost components with regard to equipment. So how do you claim it? Well, you can claim it on the basis of the hire or the rental costs for any equipment. So that makes sense. And that shows, you know, we're looking at that base cost. Note, however, you can't claim that if the equipment's owned by your parent, sister, related company, because that could leave things open for misuse, so inflating the higher cost, for example. So the second bullet point deals with that. Equipment owned by or an HP with the contractor stroke, you know, parent or sister company, that equipment is costed at open market rates. So yeah, so that's, I think, fairly self-explanatory. So the next slide, please. Okay, so we've got two extras here in the schedule as regards equipment. I think they're, particularly the first bullet point, is pretty unique. So this relates to equipment that is purchased specifically for the contract that we're claiming on. And in this instance, there's a lot of words there, but effectively how the costing is prepared is by working out the cost of the depreciation of the piece of equipment. So the logic here is contractor or subcontractor buys a piece of equipment for £1,000 just for this project. End of the project, it's going to sell it. So you work out the depreciation over, you know, however long it's used. It might be a 6-month project. You know, it's used for 6 months. It might depreciate by, say, 60%. So it's going to be worth, I can't remember how much I said it, we bought it for 10 grand. If it's depreciated by 60%, it's going to be worth 4 grand. So at the end of the project, contractor can sell it for 4 grand. So that's where you get the depreciation being the payment made by the paying party, the £6,000. The other item is the special equipment. So if there's any special equipment required on the project, then it's supposed to be listed in the contract data and paid at the rate stated. And both of those state that you don't get payment unless these are referred to in the contract data or the project manager agrees to them. Now, you know, you might be happy to rely on the good nature of the project manager, but if it was me, I'd want to make sure those items were definitely in the contract data if they were relevant, rather than relying on the goodwill of the project manager once you're in contract. Next slide, please. So again, checks and balances. So for both the schedule and the shorter schedule, we have some sort of extra provisions. So first one is any equipment that's consumed, that's claimed, you know, at the rates paid. So the example there is petrol used in the equipment. The cost of transporting equipment to working areas, to site, erecting, dismantling, etc. That's all claimable, that's all payable by the paying party, providing, and again, part of the checks and balances, providing it's not included as part of the hire or rental rate. So it sort of makes sense. It's all aimed at avoiding double counting. And again, the cost of the operative can be included here, providing it's not also claimed in the cost of the people. So we're just avoiding double counting here. Next slide, please. Okay, so moving on to the third item, the plant and materials. So this is the bricks and mortar, basically, element. It is defined in the contract. So it's basically what's included within the works. Happily for me, the schedule and the shorter schedule for these are identical. What the guidance notes say that it doesn't cover the cost of procurement. So particularly if you're going to have a big procurement exercise for plant and materials, you need to consider including that as an extra Z clause. So next slide, please. So again, these provisions are broadly analogous with the equipment. So we're looking at the checks and balances to cover all the cost, but avoid double counting. So the first bullet point, it includes, basically the contractor can claim and the subcontractor can claim payment for delivery to site or working areas and delivery from working areas if there's any plant and materials left over at the end of the project. You can also claim for the provision of and removing packaging. So that would be time removing packaging, also for sampling and testing. It also, so these are the checks and balances, the contractor provides a credit for payments received for the disposal of plant and materials. So if anything's returned, etc. And there's a deterrent for, to try and prevent over ordering as well. So if we can move to the next slide, please. Okay, so these are these charges. It's not defined in NEC, and as I've said, it's sort of a miscellaneous mix of things. But essentially, the contractor's consumables. So it includes water, gas, electric. That's calculated for the shorter schedule on a percentage basis. So the contract data part 2 has to have a percentage in to allow that to be claimed by the contractor. It also includes payments to public authorities, statutory undertakers, etc. So that's both the schedule and the shorter schedule. So if we can have the next slide, please. It includes the cost of cancellation of a CE. It includes inspection certificates, charges for others, so they're contractors' people to visit the working areas. And it includes those consumables and equipment provided by the contractor for the project manager or supervisor's offices if that's required. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. Yeah, so it also includes the provision of these, what we've already covered. So, you know, catering and also any equipment that goes in the site cabins and also hand tools. For both the schedule and the shorter schedule, there's a percentage calculation. So for the shorter schedule, the percentage includes a whole raft of things. So it includes those consumables, the water, the electricity, for example. It includes the items at bullet point 1. The percentage, as we've discussed, needs to be inserted in contract data part 2. And to my mind, it would be, because it includes more items, logically, I would imagine it would be a bigger percentage for the shorter schedule than for the schedule, because the schedule covers a smaller number of items. It includes all of the above, except it doesn't include the water, gas and electricity, which is included in the shorter schedule. Now, so that's quite complicated, but to make things slightly more complicated, these percentages have been removed from NEC4, which possibly, in terms of understanding how it works, makes it simpler, because it just means subcontractors got to prove, the costs for all of these items, rather than working out which ones are on a percentage basis and which ones aren't. So when we talk about them being on a percentage basis, we're talking about the percentage that is in the contract data multiplied by the people cost for that particular piece of work, which sort of makes sense, because I suppose, if you've got lots of people working on an item, then, the catering, the cost, the amount of water used, the amount of electricity used, etc., will increase. So it sort of makes sense, but you'll appreciate that it's a fairly rough and ready calculation. Next slide, please. Okay, we can cover this fairly quickly. So as we've already seen, this is for manufacture and fabrication of pieces of equipment off-site. So probably not hugely used for your projects, but basically contractor can claim the basic sum paid for producing that piece of equipment off-site, and also there's a percentage, again, a percentage figure goes in the contract data part 2 that allows for the overhead and profit to be claimed for the manufacture and fabrication off-site. So next slide, please. So design, again, similar to the last one, in that it's off-site design. Design's not covered, it's not a defined term in NEC. The shorter and the schedules are identical, and basically this covers the number of hours spent by the designer off-site carrying out the design work, multiplied by the rates that are used. And then we have an overhead calculation, so similar to the previous one. The overhead connection, the overhead percentage is included in the contract data part 2. And it's basically the calculation of hours times hourly rate, whatever the total is, multiplied by the percentage in the contract data to cover the overhead and profit for the designer. And in addition, any cost of travel is included as extra for the designers, so I suppose travelling to site, etc. So that's claimable as an extra also. So next slide, please. And that just covers insurance, which we've covered already, and of course needs to be forgotten because it's not particularly helpful for our purposes. Next slide, please. So we've got a few problems with the schedules and the shorter schedules, and it's mainly around, so we've got people here, it's mainly around having to prove the actual cost for individuals rather than having rates. Rates are good in that they're easy, but of course in high inflation, particularly for a project that's going to last a number of months or a number of years, rates aren't particularly good if you don't have an inflation clause included in the project, in the contract. So if we can move on to the next slide, and again, I think a lot of these are self-explanatory. It's around proving the actual cost, and also the next slide, Jen, which is the same for plant and materials. So if we can move on to the next slide, which I think is, NEC4. We've got a couple of new compensation events, which I think we covered last month. They're not big news, to be honest. So 60.120 makes it a compensation event for the contractor's cost of preparing a quote for a proposed instruction in circumstances where the PM does not accept that proposed instruction. So it's quite limited. You've got to fulfill that, all that criteria. So it's all it is the cost of preparing the quote. It's got to be a quote for a proposed instruction, and it's got to be a proposed instruction where the PM decides not to proceed with it. So don't get that muddled with an ordinary compensation event. The proposed instruction is a very discrete item. It's actually rarely used in my experience, but it's effectively the project manager approaches the contractor or the subcontractor and says, look, we're thinking of instructing a change. Can you cost it? Can you give us a quote for doing it? And then we'll decide if we want to proceed. So in that circumstance, all the contractor does is prepare the quote. It does not, absolutely does not proceed with the work. So, hopefully you'll see why it's not going to be a major it's not going to be a major issue on most projects because it's quite a discrete scenario. And then second bullet point, clause 60.121, any additional CEs in the contract data part 1. So this merely puts right at the end of the contract, I think it's at the end of the contract data part 1, a part 4, the paying party, the employer or the contractor in a subcontract, to add some additional CEs. I don't like this because for me it means that we've got 2 places to look for additional CEs now, contract data part 1 and also the Z clauses, which to me just means inefficiency. But that's where we are. And of course, when you are reviewing contracts in a tender or in a bid situation, you just need to check both to see if there are any additional CEs. Next slide, please. So we're going to quickly look at the adds and omits from in NEC4. I think we've covered them all. So the first bullet point is we've only now, for options C, D and E, we only now use the schedule. There's no facility to use the shorter schedule. And of course, it was rarely used anyway. So it's removed from options C, D and E. We've already seen that second sub-bullet point that the percentage in that charges section for working out some of those charges, that's been removed. So you're going to have to be proving actual cost. And the subcontractor fee percentage has been removed because it's now been put into the schedule and shorter schedules of cost components, as we've discussed. And then I think we've got the final slide, which is what's been added to NEC4, the subcontractor section, as we've already seen. So that limits the defined costs that we've already covered. And the penultimate sub-bullet point that refers to the shorter schedule. So for the shorter schedule now we have people rates inserted. So it means the contract data part 2 has a section to include people rates. Be careful of missing a category. It's good because we've got that fee percentage provision that says if it's not included, it's deemed included in the fee percentage. Make sure that if you include, where you include your people rates, you have a sort of coverall at the end to say, if if a particular discipline is used and isn't covered in the above, then the rate will be market rates or whatever is deemed appropriate. Because, for example, if you have rates and you forget to put in your labourer, then there's a real argument that that's covered in your fee percentage and you wouldn't be allowed to recover anything for it. And of course, bear in mind that whilst rates are good, it makes it easier to claim. you know, in a period of high inflation, particularly for a long project, commercially, are those rates going to be good, you know, at the end of the contract period? And I think if we can move to the next slide, I think that's everything, and it is. So I think I saw some questions, but too busy talking to read them.
Yeah, so I too thought that I saw some questions, but they don't seem to be there anymore. So I can only assume that possibly the questions that were asked were then answered on later slides.
Oh, right.
If anybody does have any questions, then if you want to pop those over to me on email, then I can collate those